Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. This is Fahim Niaz. I'm the product manager for Anime Studio. I'm also joined here by Michi Catanese, the product specialist. As well, we have Chad Troftgruben, who will be presenting our webinar today. We're delighted to have him here. He's from Incredible Tutorials. He's got a ton of experience with Flash and Anime Studio. So today his webinar topic will be the benefits of Anime Studio for Flash users. So we'll move on to the next slide here. Right before we begin the presentation, there's a few housekeeping items that I'd like to chat with everyone about, just so that everyone's on the same page. Thank you for joining us, so welcome to all. Everyone is muted except for the panelists, so that includes myself, Michi, and Chad. We have a Q&A window that I would recommend that you use to ask questions. And to make comments. Please start asking questions right away. We'll be answering the majority of the questions at the end of the webinar as soon as Chad is done with his presentation. As with any webinar, we'll be recording this presentation, and then we'll also make it available on our website and on YouTube in about a week's time. And if there are any technical issues, I would like for you to pardon us. Sometimes the WebEx system that we're using does end up causing glitches. So the next slide is a little bit of an introduction on Chad. So Chad and I have been exchanging emails for quite a bit of time, and I found his tutorials incredibly enlightening, especially those that help Flash users move on to Anime Studio. And Chad has an enormous amount of experience in cartoon animation. He's a freelance animator right now. He's done a ton of tutorials for other companies and such on the topics of Flash and other products. And he's got an in-depth knowledge of Anime Studio. And he's a creator of IncredibleTutorials.com. Make sure to check that website out whenever you have a chance. And he really dedicates the majority of his time helping others animate. So we're glad and we're really happy to have Chad here on the line with us and presenting his webinar and the benefits of Anime Studio for Flash users. So without further ado, I will ask Michi to pass the mic to Chad. So thank you, Chad.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad that you're all here, and I think this is going to be fun and hopefully educational. So, and just a little bit more kind of about me, just to set up this webinar. I started working with Flash back in 2002 when I was just a sophomore in high school, and that makes me feel really old by saying that. But my goal was to create animated cartoons, to create these animated stories that were in my head that I could present to people. And so for years, I went with Flash. I used Flash as my primary animation tool, and that's just how I thought it was. I thought that was the best software to use for this. So about a year ago, my friend came to me and he said that I should try out Anime Studio because he thought it might benefit me in some cases with my animation techniques. And I didn't really believe him at first because, hey, I had Flash. It's the best software there is for this type of stuff, is it not? Well, I tried Anime Studio out, and before I knew it, I was converting all of my animation work to the software, my own personal animation work anyway. And that to me there's a lot of benefits to it, and that's what I'm going to be presenting here. So this webinar is coming from the perspective of a Flash user wanting to try out Anime Studio, and therefore I'll be making comparisons between features that each has, the similarities, the differences, and which ultimately has the benefit over the other. And just one more thing to point out before I get started. Flash is an all-around, a very robust piece of software. You can do web design with it, you can create interactive media, you can do mobile applications, and a host of other stuff, including cartoon animation. But for this webinar, I'll be focusing primarily on the cartoon animation aspects that Flash provides versus Anime Studio. So with that, what I'm going to do now is go through each point step by step and show you guys features and compare the features of each software. So to start, I think the easiest thing to do is to start with the basics. So I now have a new document open in Flash, And I'm going to show you the differences of the drawing tools that each provides. And so it all starts with a simple line. I'll take my pencil tool here in Flash and just draw out a simple line. Now, with Flash, for many years, many people have regarded Flash's drawing tools as exceptional because it has this free flow vector style to it. Meaning, if I take my selection tool and try to work with the line, at any point on the line, I can manipulate the drawing. It doesn't matter where the cursor is, as long as it's there, I can manipulate the drawing, and I can select part of the drawing and move it around if I want to. And it just, there's a lot of freedom there, and a lot of people liked that. It was a new concept at the time when Flash was released. But the thing is, when you work with this, while it's nice to have that freedom, there isn't a whole lot of control to it, I have come to realize. And I realized this once I started working with Anime Studio. Because while Anime Studio has a similar drawing style to it, it actually works on a point system, which at first, when I started working with Anime Studio, kind of took me back a little bit. I wasn't really sure if I could get a handle on it because it just seemed a little bit different. So let's bring up Anime Studio and I will demonstrate what I mean by this. So I will take the Freehand tool, which is just like the pencil tool in Flash. And again, I will draw out a line. You'll notice when I release the cursor, I have a bunch of red dots set up within the line. And these are the dots I was referring to when it comes to putting down your line. Now, when you take your Translate Point tool to manipulate the line, you'll notice that you can only manipulate the line by clicking on the dots. Now, at first, this might seem a little bit restricting, because let's say I want to edit a point right here where there is none, and I can't, because I just select the whole line. While this might seem restricting, which it's not, because if I wanted a point there, I could simply click the Add Point tool and put a point there. I can also, I just have more control over this in general, I would say, because the points, you can move them much more freely than you could in Flash. You have more control. And I think you can already see that just the way I'm manipulating. And you can even go to the point where you can connect objects together and fill them in. So again, this is a very basic feature I decided it'd be good to start with. But usually when you start with a program like this, you want to dive in and you want to start designing. When I went from Flash to Anime Studio, this again was different, but I quickly came to realize that I liked this method better because it gave me more control and it allowed me to just morph and shape my objects the way I wanted them without having to redraw a lot and just in general having to position lines in different ways. So that is, I would say, a big difference between Flash and Anime Studio, and also the first step on our journey here today. So now that we have the drawing stuff out of the way, oh, and there is one more thing I should point out too, just for Flash users when it comes to drawing. When you are in Anime Studio, you do have also the benefit of being able to manipulate your lines as well. So for instance, if you want, you could adjust the line width of a point. And you can do this in Flash, but it's more of a manual process. So if I click here on this point and put it to 0 with the line width tool, you can see I can manipulate the line in that fashion. I can taper off the line in that way, as well as hide points if I wish, while keeping the fill intact. Again, you can do this in Flash, but with the brush tool, which would probably be your best bet for something like this, you have to find a brush shape that works, and then draw it out. And then from there, if you want to taper off a line, which it kind of does a little bit automatically, but you would have to grab the eraser tool and try to taper it off like that. And people do create some pretty nice looking art this way. However, I think Anime Studio's tool set gives you more options. And so that's just another benefit for the drawing tools and such. And I think when you come to use Anime Studio a bit more, you'll realize that tools like the Add Point tool, which allow you to just add points down, as opposed to freestyle drawing, gives you greater control over your own creations. So there we go. Okay, now I'm done with the drawing aspect. Next, I want to move on to what's probably the biggest component, and that is the animation types that each software provides. Now, with Anime Studio, the biggest draw for the animation is the bone tool system. A bone, for those of you who don't know, basically allows you to create a skeletal structure for a character or an object and move that character as if it has a skeleton. So you can have your arms move with joints and your legs and so forth. Anime Studio has had this in for quite some time in its software. Flash, on the other hand, it's a new feature. It's fairly new. It came in play, I think, in Flash CS4 about 4 years ago. So let's take a look at the differences between these two softwares. Coming from Flash to Anime Studio, are you going to benefit from the bone tool in Anime Studio? First, I will bring up my project file here for this demonstration, and I will do the same for Anime Studio as well, just so I have it ready to go. And on my project file, I have two characters. One is what I'll be working with on the left, and on the right is a completed character, just so I can show you guys the final results. So in Flash, we have our characters drawn out, and we now want to add a bone structure to our characters to animate them out. Well, first, I'll want to go into my symbol for my character, so I'll take the selection tool and double-click to go in. And here, the problem comes into play with the fact that you don't have an ability to create an armature layer like you would in Anime Studio. In order to apply a bone, you basically have to draw the bone out, and then the layer for that bone will be automatically placed. And the other problem, I would say, with Flash is that when you do this, all of your assets need to be on one layer. And for someone like me who likes to draw on multiple layers, this can be kind of a problem because, as you can see, I have 6 layers right now that make up this character. If I put them all on one layer, it kind of disrupts the way I design, and it can be kind of difficult to work with. So for this demonstration, what I'm going to do is simply put down 2 bones for the legs, because it's going to make it simpler in the long run, and it'll give you an idea as to how this bone tool works in Flash. So let me zoom in here. And then what I need to do first is break apart the legs if they are symbols. So I'll just go Control-B to break these apart. And you can apply bones to symbols, but in this case, just to make it easier, because they can be finicky, I will just apply it to a vector graphic. Next, I want to hide all the layers that don't relate to this first leg, because if you try to apply the bone with other layers present, you will intersect with different layers, and it can be kind of a pain in this process, and you'll have to start over. I'll select that vector graphic, come over here to the bone tool, and draw out my bone. Now I'll do the same for the second leg. Okay, now one thing you will probably notice as I did this, if you look on the timeline, layer 5 and layer 6 are empty. That's because they were converted to armature layer 6 and 8. So when you put down the bone tool is when your armature layer or your bone layer becomes present, and it's automatic. So let's view this whole thing now, and let's try to animate with our selection tool. And as you can see, we now can move our legs in any way we wish. So there are a couple things I need to point out with this method. So this might seem great, you know, you're able to do the animation, but there are some limitations to this. First of all, the limitation of only having one layer per, one layer per bone is a limitation in itself, because as I said, if you draw with multiple layers, you're going to have to convert all those layers onto one layer. Secondly, let's say you want to add some shoelaces to your shoe. You've done the bone animation and you just want to add some more details now to your character. What you can do, you can take your pencil tool like you would, and you're going to draw on this layer. You're going to get an error. It's going to tell you that you cannot draw on an armature layer. The same goes with if you need to manipulate the shape in any way. You might have to try this. Nope, it doesn't work, because with the selection tool, you are manipulating the bone. And so basically, once you have set down your bone on an object, you're pretty much locked in with that object for the duration of the project. You can do some simple things like fill, but it's pretty limiting. And if you, let's say, messed up on something, you need to really tweak something on the leg, what you're going to have to do is break the bone off. You're going to have to break apart the vector graphic, or just disable the bone and start over and redraw it. And so it can be, again, a process when working with this. Now finally, and this is probably the most important thing about Flash's armature system, since it's new, and since it was pretty much tacked on to the existing Flash interface, it just simply doesn't work very well. And you can ask anyone who works in Flash, especially with the bone tool, to any extent. I've had many people who watch my tutorials complain about this as well. Sometimes the bone will disappear, sometimes the object that your bone is on will disappear, or sometimes Flash will crash. It seems like it's inevitable. It seems like it always happens when you work with the bone tool to some extent. So because of that, it's a little bit unreliable, to be honest. And it works to some extent, but at the same time, it's one of those things where it's hard to invest in, because who knows when it's going to work and how it's going to work. Now, let's pop over to Anime Studio and see the difference here. First, you create a bone layer initially for your skeletal structure. And you can do that with the new layer option. You can create a bone. And as you can see, I have 2 bone layers on my panel already that I have set up. And within your bone layer, you can put any number of layers, vector layers, that you want. So what we can do here is we have all sorts of different layers. We can design our character how we want it. And when we are done, we can go to the bone layer itself and zoom in, take the Add Bone tool, and just start to add bones. Now the benefit of this as well, even though Flash does this to some extent, is that you can create a hierarchy of bones. What I mean by this is one bone is controlled by the other. So you'll notice when I'm done with this arm, I come back here to the first bone, and then I click the Add Bone and continue on. That's because I'm creating a hierarchy of bones. And you can see this in progress by clicking on the Reparent Bone icon, and you can see the arrows connecting to each bone. And this works out when you are trying to create a realistic looking bone structure. And so that's one thing right off the bat that you have the advantage of, because you are able to manipulate the bones very easily and add bones as you go along. It's not set in stone. It's not like you're manipulating the assets underneath, and so you can work within those means. Now, another benefit is Anime Studio allows you to bind bones to layers if you wish, or you can use the method that you saw in Flash where the bone basically manipulates the vector graphic in some way. And so you have the option of how you want the bone to work. You can do that to an extent in Flash with the symbols, but again, it's very much more, it's just kind of harder to work with in general. Anime Studio just basically makes it easier. So once you are done manipulating your bones and setting them up and tweaking them, you can come in here now and test it out. And as you can see, it just works. And that's a real benefit to working with a program like Anime Studio. So when it comes to these two methods, between Bone Tools and Flash and Anime Studio, I would definitely say that Anime Studio has the benefit when it comes to the bone systems. Okay, so moving on now. We're talking about how to animate. Let's talk about camera movements for a moment, because when we make cartoons, it's sometimes important to move our cameras around, excuse me, to do zoom effects and the like. So let's take a look at each system that these softwares provide. And I'm just going to open up my camera file here for Flash, and I will do the same for Anime Studio. Okay, so let's say we're in Flash and we want to create a scene where the camera pans from left to right. Or we want our character to look like it's panning from left to right. Whichever, you just want to create a camera panning effect. Well, in order to do that, with just the bare bones version of Flash as it is right now when you purchase it, what you have to do is you have to animate all the symbols to correspond with that effect. Or alternatively, you could make all your symbols one symbol and then group them together and then animate accordingly. So let me explain what I mean by this. First, I'll take my character in ground and move it over this way. And then I'm going to add frames on frame 60. Then I will make the first 3 layers motion tween layers. And now I'll select the ground and the character and move it forward. Actually, oops, I want to be on frame 60 when I do that.
Hi, Chad. Can you just let everyone know what version of Flash you're using?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I'm currently using Flash CS5.
And Anime Studio 8.1 right now.
Yes, correct.
Perfect. Thank you.
So we now created a tween with frame 1 going to frame 60 of the character going that way to create that pan effect. Then we have now the ability to move the hills as well. And we might want the hills to move a little bit slower since they are more in the background. So I'll just move them a little bit slower than I did the foreground options. So now I come back to frame 1 and I hit enter, and it looks like we have sort of a pan effect going on. And of course, if I spend a little bit more time on this, I can make it a little bit more convincing. But for this demonstration purposes, that's pretty much what you would have to do. The same goes with a zoom effect. If I wanted to create a zoom effect for this movie, I would have to take the free transform tool and enlarge the assets at frame 60. And the same goes for the hills, and I'll just make them a little bit bigger. just like that. And now, if we watch this, we can see it's a zoom effect. The hills are moving slower, but we have that zoom and pan going on. And you can as well, if you want, tilt the assets to make it look like the camera is tilting. And we could just do this with the free transform tool as well. We could go in and tilt all the assets. So basically, in order to mimic camera movements, we really have to just mimic the movement by creating movement with the symbols themselves. Now in Anime Studio, there's this nice little feature on your toolbar that allows you to control the camera. When I first saw this, I was actually pretty blown away because for years I was so used to manually moving all my assets to create movements for camera movements. But if we click the track button and just move it around, we pretty much create that effect that I was doing with just a simple click of the button. And if I want to, I can go now to frame 1 and insert a keyframe, and go to frame 72 and move the camera. We now have 2 keyframes. I go back to frame 1 and hit play, and the camera pans. You can do the same for zoom in effects. There is a zoom icon on your camera panel. Insert a keyframe at frame 1, go to 72, let's pan up like this. So again, you have that zoom in effect. And finally, as I mentioned before, we can do a tilt effect. And there's actually even a 3D option for our camera to make it look like there's some 3D effects going on as well with this 4th option for the pan and tilt. So as you can see, I think it's clear that Anime Studio has a leg up on this because Flash does not have an actual camera system at all. And I think that's again because Flash is used for more than just one thing. Anime Studio, on the other hand, is used for cartoons specifically. So it was built to have all these filmmaking aspects in mind when working with it. And there are some other things to point out too. You'll notice when I did the pan that the hills were moving slower than that of the foreground. Well, I don't have to manually do that anymore. In fact, if I take my translate layer option and look at the ground, we can see that in the position properties, the Z is set to 0. Meanwhile, the hills are set to -3, meaning that they are pushed further into the background. So when you move your camera, the hills are going to correspond with that, and you're going to see a slower movement because they are further away. And to demonstrate this further, we can click on the orbit view on our workspace, and we can see that the hills are indeed in the background. So that is just very much a very easy way to do this. You can position things with depth, giving your camera pans more life, basically, and it saves you time compared to Flash. And finally, there's some neat tricks we can do as well. You'll notice when I did these pan effects that the sky, the pink sky I have drawn, stayed the same. It stayed the same position. Well, if you double click on the sky, you have the option to make your camera movements immune to that particular layer. And so that helps as well if you don't want particular objects to move. So you do have that control. So overall, I think it's safe to say that Anime Studio's camera system is better because it has a camera system. I mean, I don't think there's really an argument there. So with all that said, and I kind of showed you here a little bit, there's a 3D view which proves that Anime Studio works in 3D space. Let's talk a little bit about 3D modeling in these two programs. Now, with Flash and Anime Studio, they are 2D design tools. They're meant to create 2D works of art. So if you're looking for something extensively in 3D modeling territory, these two programs aren't it. But if you're looking to create some 3D subtle effects for your cartoons, they do both have the option. So let's jump over to Flash to show Flash's version of this first. I can go to File, New, and just create a new document for this demonstration. And I will just create a simple rectangle. Now, in order to do 3D effects in Flash, everything must be a movie clip symbol. Flash works with symbols. It's a way for organizing and manipulating different assets in your library. So I will just make this a symbol, name it rectangle, and click OK. And now I will use the 3D rotation tool and simply rotate the object. Now you'll notice as I do this, it has a 3D effect. But when I get to this point, it doesn't have any depth. It's pretty much a flat rectangle rotating in a 3D way. So what we can do here is we could make more rectangles and we could create a cube out of it, or we could, create some sort of architecture, a building if we wish. So there are ways that we can work within this and create depth with our 3D objects in Flash. However, let's jump over here to Anime Studio. I know we've been doing a lot of jumping around, and I apologize for that, but in order to compare these two, you kind of have to keep shuffling back and forth. But anyway, I will now make a rectangle, just like I did in Flash. I'll double-click on the layer itself to go to the layer properties, in this case, the 3D Options tab. For the 3D conversion, I have 3 options: extrude, lathe, and inflate. So you already have 3 options right off the bat as to how you want to make this 3D. You can play with those 2 in your own time, but I'll just use this one for right now for the demonstration. You can choose edges, silhouettes, materials, creases. You can adjust the threshold for the creases, and you even have shading options. So basically, you have a lot of options here, at least compared to Flash. You have more options. You have the ability to set this up how you want it. So once you have done all that, you click OK. And if we take our rotation layer option here and rotate the layer, you can see now that we have a 3D looking rectangle. And it actually has depth. So this, I think, in itself is beneficial because it allows us to create more convincing 3D objects. And I think it allows us to build 3D objects easier now that we are able to create these depth options. And add to that you can create different types of 3D models in Anime Studio. I think you have the benefit there as far as that's concerned. And of course, when you use the camera, you see that you can see different angles of the 3D object. So that in itself is also a benefit. So if you're doing a pan and you want that subtle 3D effect and you have 3D models in your cartoon, you're definitely going to bring off that 3D effect. And finally, if we use the orbit view for our workspace, you can see that it is indeed a 3D object. So when you compare those two, and again, it might not be a make or break deal since these are 2D animation softwares. They're not meant for 3D modeling. But when you look at it this way, I think it's safe to say that Anime Studio, again, has that leg up when it comes to Flash, when it comes to these types of features. Now, there is one thing I will point out, especially if you are working in Flash. Like, I worked in Flash for several years, and I went over to Anime Studio. And because of that, I had a set workflow in mind. I did things pretty much the same each time I made a cartoon as far as how I went about going from step A to step B and so on. In Flash, when you are working on, let's say, a cartoon that's longer, you can have cartoons that can span as long as you want, really. You have the option to have a scene panel in Flash. So let's say you have one scene that is the outside of a house, and it's zooming into the house, and then you want scene 2 to take place inside the house. Well, it was a simple matter of clicking the button, and in scene 2, it's a blank canvas. You now have the ability to create a new scene from scratch, or you can bring in, remaining assets from your other scenes, and you can just build your movie like this, going from scene to scene to scene. It's kind of a way to organize it. And I used to do this all the time. Sometimes I had upwards to 300 scenes per project file in Flash. When I went to Anime Studio, I realized there actually wasn't a scene panel. And so I was a little taken back by that. I was a little, concerned. But I came to quickly realize that this was a better way. And it might seem like I'm stretching here, but hear me out. When I was working on larger projects in Flash, I would have scenes upwards to, again, 300 scenes per project. This would cause Flash to stutter, crash, and sometimes just not work. And I can tell you, when you're working on something and it corrupts your file because it crashes too many times, it can be a real pain. And so when I went over to Anime Studio and I had this one project file per scene thing, I came to quickly realize that I could organize my projects better. And because of that, I was able to focus on each scene more specifically. And I could save my assets to the universal library, which I could use in later project files. And so then I would save each scene and bring them into a video editing software and compile all the clips. And this isn't so much which software is better. It's more or less a note that if you're going to get into this, I know a lot of cartoonists use the scene panel. You're going to have to adjust your workflow. But for me, it wasn't too much of an adjustment because I came to realize that I liked being able to work on each individual project file separately. It kept my resources from becoming too drowned out, and it allowed me to just focus on each scene individually without being overwhelmed by all these scenes. And it also allowed me to work within one scene without the worry that it is going to affect another scene's symbol. Because with Flash, if you manipulate one symbol, you manipulate all the same symbol, and it becomes kind of a nightmare if you accidentally forget to duplicate the symbol. So that's just a point I wanted to make for cartoonists who like to make longer cartoons. Now finally, we come to the end of making your cartoon, and that is you want to export your video. So your cartoon's all done, it's a masterpiece, it's the best thing in the world, everyone's going to love it, but you want to share it. In this regard, Flash and Anime Studio are same, but actually really, really different, and I will explain what I mean by that. So in Flash, if I'm wanting to export my movie, I go to File, Export, Export Movie. I choose where I want to save the movie, and I click Save. And from here, you have some settings you can work with. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing, at least it did for me. So you have your width and height, and that makes sense, the size of your movie and all this stuff. When you come down here to store temporary data, that's where things get a little tricky, because you have the option to choose in memory for higher frame rates or on disk for longer movies. Well, the first thought that came to my head when I was doing this was, well, what if I have a long movie with high frame rates? Which one do I choose? Well, the honest answer to that is it really doesn't matter, because either way, it's probably not going to work. But from there, you can choose your compression settings just like you would in any other program. And once you're done, you just hit export, and the movie exports. However, again, if you have a detailed movie with a lot of layers, if you have a higher frame rate, if the movie is longer, chances are it's not going to work. It's either going to stutter on the frame rate, it's going to glitch, you're going to get these weird pixelization issues, or you're going to get a combination of those two, or the sound will go off sync, And it's really just a nightmare. And it doesn't really matter which one you choose because it just doesn't seem to work either way. So with that, I had to resort in Flash to exporting my images, exporting each frame rather as an image through the use of image streaming. I would then take the images, put them into an external program like After Effects or something else, export that as a video, then bring it into my video editing software like Adobe Premiere, and then work on the video. However, if I noticed I did something wrong, let's say on scene 80, I forgot to add something, I had to go back into Flash, find scene 80, delete all the scenes except for scene 80, then export it out as an image stream, then convert it, and then the process, you know, it was just a very long process. Now with Anime Studio, if you go to File, Export Animation, you can choose some render quality settings here. You can choose your output format, just like Flash. You click OK. You find a place to save it. You have your compression settings, and you can choose whatever works best for you. You click OK, and it just works. I have never once had a problem with the exporting function in Anime Studio. Every time the video has come out smooth, all my assets were in place. I didn't have to worry about movie clip symbols not animating, because that's another issue with Flash when you have movie clip symbols and you render out videos. And I think it's just a huge time saver because I don't have to go through the process. Even though Anime Studio allows you to export image streams, I don't have to do that. I don't have to export my image stream to convert it to make sure it works. It just seems to always work with Anime Studio. And to me, that in itself is an invaluable asset to Anime Studio, being able to actually have your videos export. I know it's crazy, but I like to actually share my work and not have to spend my life exporting images and converting. So I would say that that is definitely also an advantage to Anime Studio. And just a couple other points to point out about the differences between these two softwares. You do have timeline differences. For instance, you'll notice when I am in Flash, the timeline shows all the layers, and it shows what's going on in each of those layers at once. And this can be beneficial if you want a bird's eye view of what's happening. However, it can become problematic if you want to do something to one layer and you accidentally affect the other layer. And you can lock and hide layers, but again, if you have a bunch of layers and you're trying to figure out what your project looks like, it can become kind of a pain. And also too, if you're on one layer, I have layer 1 highlighted, I can accidentally always select a different layer. And I know now that Anime Studio 8 has the ability to have the vector selector, which allows you to select vector graphics like this. So if you're coming over from Flash to Anime Studio and you still prefer being able to click on anything at any given time, you can still do that now in Anime Studio with the vector selector. However, I do prefer the default way that Anime Studio has it set up, and I will just open a project here to demonstrate that. When you have one layer selected in Anime Studio, you are within that layer's timeline and only that timeline. That's the only timeline you see. When you go to a different layer, let's say the mouth layer, you'll see now that there's keyframes set up. That's because we are in the mouth layer's timeline. And because of this, I cannot manipulate any other layer. I can't select a layer and I can't manipulate it unless if I select a new layer. I really like that because it gives me control and allows me to focus on the layer. But of course, there is the vector shape selector that works like Flash if you really want that option. So basically, Anime Studio gives you the choice of how you want to affect your layers. And then of course, there's the layers themselves. In Flash, when you create a new layer, you basically just do that. It's just a blank layer. You can create folders if you wish, but certain types of layers, like the motion tween layers, don't come into play until you apply a motion tween. The same goes with the armature layer. So basically, you're pretty much limited to how you work with your layers, I would say. with Anime Studio, you have a whole set of layers right off the bat. You can choose your drawing layers, an image layer for imported images, folder layers or group layers, the bone layer we talked about, the switch layer, which acts like a group, but allows you to switch things in and out on the fly, which I love. It's great for animating mouths, or maybe you want a character to have multiple angles, or maybe you want to have a hand animate or have different positions for a hand, like an open palm or a closed fist. So I think Anime Studio, again, gives you the flexibility of different layer types. And finally, Anime Studio has a difference in the fact on its timeline, you have frame 0. At first, this confused me. I was like, what is frame 0? Why is there a frame 0? But it's basically a workspace area that allows you to manipulate your characters or your objects before you actually animate them. So when you're on frame 0, if you're trying out the bones, anything you do on frame 0 will not affect your animation, because right when you go to frame 1, you are set back to default. And even when you go back to frame 0, it still snaps to default. So frame 0 allows you to basically have a workspace and try things out before you actually animate, which again, I think is great. It was a little confusing at first, but once I got used to it, I use it all the time because I like to be able to test my stuff out. And finally, there is the character wizard in Anime Studio, which is great if you're new and you just want to get going on animation. You have the ability to create preset characters, and you can fiddle around with the presets and adjust all sorts of attributes for those characters. So that gives you a running start if you're new and you just want to jump in. And finally, you have the option of going to Content Paradise, which allows you to buy and sell assets for Anime Studio. And this is, again, great if you are looking to just jump in and you want preset characters. You can go buy characters or objects that other people have made and get going on your production. So those are just some other little minor advantages I would say that Anime Studio has. But anyway, to wrap this up, I would say, given everything that I have said here, and given from my own personal experiences, that Anime Studio is way more user-friendly for animators than Flash is. And that's because Flash has a wide focus, while Anime Studio focuses on the cartoon elements that are important, like the animation, like the bone tool, the camera movements, and even subtle things like the 3D effects and how videos export. So I think if you are going from Flash to Anime Studio, or if you're curious about it, or if you're curious about both softwares, you should definitely give Anime Studio a shot. Anyway, I hope you guys found this webinar to be informational, and I'm going to pass the mic back over now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chad. We really appreciate you covering all these important topics for many of our users that have joined us. We appreciate your time. We have several questions that I was going to ask you, and at the same time, I'd like to ask our participants to continue asking questions so that we may be able to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes answering those questions. So one of the first questions that came up was the highest resolution for a project created in Anime Studio and being able to reach broadcast quality. So I'll answer this question, and I'll say that in the Pro version, you can definitely create animations that are 9,000 by 9,000 pixels, and usually it's just limited by the ability of your computer, and that's full HD, that's perfect for broadcast and all that sort of stuff. Did you have anything to mention about that yourself, Chad?
I do believe that Flash allows you to make the work area as big as you want it. If I go here to my stage settings, I do know that, yeah, it is pretty much limited to your computer, the way, how fast your computer processes information and all that kind of stuff. But right now, as you can see, I have it set to the lowest HD resolution.
Right.
But I believe Flash allows you to replicate that, what you said, that broadcast dimension. It just, as you can see here, you don't have, Anime Studio kind of lays it out for you, what's broadcast friendly and stuff. Flash really doesn't. That's one of the differences. So.
Okay, perfect. Well, in that respect, they're pretty similar, I suppose, as far as broadcast quality. Another question that's come up is, how well are you able to integrate projects created in Anime Studio into Flash projects?
Going from Anime Studio to Flash?
Correct.
Well, I guess either way. You know, you can't import the files either way from one or the other. So it's kind of like you have to almost start over. I actually had to do that when I went from Flash to Anime Studio. What I did was I would actually trace a lot of my designs over and just redraw them in Anime Studio. And I think the same would have to be applied for going from Anime Studio to Flash. It's just kind of the way each program is set up.
Right, that makes sense. With respect to switch layers, that's one of my favorite sort of functions in Anime Studio. Did you want to expand on that a little bit so that folks that are from the Flash world can get a bit of an appreciation of that?
Yeah, sure. I'll actually show it. So when you have the switch layer, which I have one for the mouth right now, we can see that I have different vector shapes within this. So I have all of my mouth positions laid out, like a smile, open, close, and so on. And when I go to the switch layer itself and I start going, I can basically switch in and out these layers. Like, let's say at this point I wanted a closed mouth. I can close it, so now it's closed. And then at this frame I wanted to do that, and so on. So basically you can set up all the assets you want within the switch layer and then swap them in and out at any point on the timeline.
Nice. With respect to lip syncing, I know how Anime Studio works. How does Flash handle lip syncing?
There is, I know Anime Studio has the automatic lip syncing features in it, but Flash doesn't have anything like that. So with Flash, you're basically more on your own. For instance, with this method I was using, I'm not sure if a lot of people use this lip syncing method the way I do it. This is actually a method I sort of adapted from my Flash use. But when I was in Flash, a lot of the times what I had to do was I would create a symbol for my mouth, and I would create upwards to, like, say, 15 frames of a mouth doing different things. I would then alternate the frame that the symbol would stop on each time I would want to move the mouth. So that's just one way you can do it. There are so many different ways you can do it in both programs, but that's just an example of one way I would approach it in Flash, was use a symbol and adjust the frames.
Okay, nice. Now, another question is with respect to tweening with Anime Studio and with respect to Flash. Did you want to comment on the differences between the two?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. Actually, it's kind of funny because Flash seems to have adopted Anime Studio's way of tweening in the fact that once you move something, like for instance, I have this tween layer set up. Once you move it, insert the keyframe automatically and is in place, just like that. So in that regard, there aren't a lot of differences. You have to do the extra step of creating your tweened layers in Flash in order for it to tween. Both programs basically allow you to grab and drag your objects across the stage or screen and basically automatically tween it. I would say though that the way the bones work, the way they tween in Anime Studio, it just seems to look a little bit more pleasing, and you can of course always tweak that stuff. But in regards to the tweening aspect, I think if you're just looking just to move stuff across the screen from point A to point B, you're probably going to have about the same amount of work each way, I would say, even though I prefer Anime Studio's just kind of dive in and work. It just works type of mentality. So.
My other question that's come up is, what would you recommend to Flash users that are using Anime Studio? How would you get them interested, or at least moving from Flash to Anime Studio? What would you recommend?
Well, first, I would recommend that you download a trial of Anime Studio. First and foremost, I think the only way to know if it's right for you is to try it. And since it's a 30-day free trial, there's really no risk involved there. Secondly, I would recommend you look at some tutorials, maybe even my tutorials if you want, and look at other people's works. That can be a very inspiring thing. I know Smith Micro has their forum set up for Anime Studio where people can go and share their works. I would recommend you go there and look at some works and see what people are making in this program and give you inspiration as to what you could do, with it. So.
Perfect. And with that note, I was wondering if you could show us your incredibletutorials.com website. Maybe
Sure.
give us a bit of an overview as to what you've done there, and let the participants know they can come to you for some information and such.
Yes. Well, this is my website, incredibletutorials.com, and I have tutorials on many different subjects: Flash, Anime Studio, Joomla, and a few others. And if you click on Anime Studio, right at the top here, I have, I think right now, over 20 different tutorials for it. But I have a lot of different tutorials ranging from how to draw a character to simple things like how to do text, frame-by-frame animation if that's something you're interested in, and just a whole list of them. You can go through and check out all these tutorials and see which ones you would like to watch. And I think my tutorials are really focused for beginners, especially right now. That was my goal. I usually roll out beginner tutorials first before I go into more extensive and advanced tutorials. I eventually have plans to do tutorials like doing how to create a cartoon from start to finish in Anime Studio. And hopefully those types of tutorials will benefit people. But yeah, if you go to my website, you can definitely find all sorts of tutorials there, and you can send me questions. I also have a weekly video blog where I answer questions from viewers as well. So, and that's the Chad chat icon right here. You can click and answer questions and view the different episodes.
Perfect. Now we have another comment that a user made, that one of the benefits of Anime Studio is that you can export specific parts of an animation, whereas in Flash that's not possible. So that seems to be a good benefit.
Yes, I would agree with that. I actually haven't worked with that too much, but I have heard that, and that's just it. Anime Studio gives you more control, I would say. Even like over what you want to export. Like you can choose the frames between which frame and which frame you want to export. Even little things like that help me when I'm working with my cartoons. So yes, I would agree with that.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much there, Chad. This to the end of the webinar. So I wanted you to realize that the webinar will be up on our website, and you can access it via anime.smithmicro.com/webinars.html. I really wanted to take this opportunity to thank Chad for his time. It was an incredible webinar. I really learned a lot about Flash, and I think I have more tools now to present to other people and to let them know that these are the benefits of Anime Studio over or the benefits of Anime Studio over Flash and other products, including what you mentioned earlier. So thank you very much, Chad, for your time, and make sure to visit Chad's website at incredibletutorials.com. And for the rest of the participants, please also make sure to follow us and like us on Facebook and Twitter. We're pretty easily found there. All you have to do is in the search bar, search for Anime Studio, and you'll find us there. So thank you very much, Chad.
Thank you.